COPA.
What's up, everybody? Another episode of Rfk Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Varendes, and I am back with another amazing episode. And I'm sure a lot of podcast hosts say that quite often, but this one is absolutely an awesome podcast. We just go through so much information on a very, very important historical event, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and we go deep. We talk about everything from Sirhan to MK Ultra to why they killed him, who killed him, all that stuff. So please enjoy please take notes and enjoy the show because there's a lot of information. And the guest today is James DiEugenio. He's been on before. We recently had him on, I say recently, probably a couple months ago or something like that, to talk about the Rfk Assassination. So please go back in the archives, check that one out. Just look up the Ripple Effect Podcast and then put in the word MLK or, assassinations or something like that. It'll come up pretty easily. Or while I'm doing this intro, I can just find the actual number and then give it to you, which I just did, and it's episode 155. So go back in the archives, check out episode 155, and we talk about the MLK assassination. Like I said, today we talk about the Robert Kennedy assassination. A very interesting and fascinating story. Tons of holes in the story, and like I said, we go through all that. So thanks everybody for listening. Remember to subscribe to us on YouTube, RV Theory 6. Follow me on Twitter, RV Theory 6. Instagram, RV Theory 6. If you the Ripple Effect Podcast has a Facebook page, so you can like us there. Also, if you want to friend request me on Facebook, Ricky Varendes or Ricardo Varendes, just look me up. And if you don't look like a robot, a creeper, or somebody trying to sell me porn, then I will accept your friend request, and we could be friends, and you can see what's going on in my life and all that stuff, and we can share articles and like each other's pages and all that fun stuff that happens on Facebook, minus all the manipulation and propaganda and selling of our data and information that Facebook does. We can just ignore all that and just do the fun stuff. So all joking aside, enjoy the show. If you find it interesting or important, please share it. Tweet this episode, post it on a website or wherever. All my work's open source, so feel free to share it wherever you want. I think it's much more important just to get this information out there. So thanks again, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I have a bunch of guests that I'm working on scheduling, so hopefully very soon we'll get a couple more episodes and with some really interesting guests that I'm really excited to have on. So take care, guys. See you on the next one. Peace. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for being with me. I really appreciate it. It's awesome to have you back, and I'm glad I have you on to talk about the Rfk assassination. Last time you were on, we did the Martin Luther King assassination, and I feel like there's tons of researchers that focus on the JFK assassination, but the other two and Malcolm X, there's not as much conversation about, but I think equally as important. And the interesting thing is the Robert Kennedy assassination happened only 2 months after the last one we just talked about, the Martin Luther King assassination. And it's crazy how this was all going on in the 60s. And there's been a little conversation about Robert Kennedy recently because his Robert Kennedy Jr., the son, has been a little bit more outspoken about his questions of the official story and stuff like that. But let's get, I guess, right into what is the official story. What's the official story? What does the media, I guess, apparently presented to us on what was the cut and dry story.
Well, the official story about the Robert Kennedy assassination is that the lone gunman at the Ambassador Hotel that night in the pantry was a young man named Sirhan Bissara Sirhan, and that he took all the shots in the pantry that night, and he was the lone assassin of Senator Kennedy. Now, the problem with that, well, there's literally 100 problems with that, but the problem with that is that it only came to that conclusion for the rather simple reason that Sirhan's lawyers decided not to contest the charges. See, that's a fallacy about the RFK case, that he had a trial and he was adjudicated guilty. What really happened is that his lawyers decided not to put up any kind of a defense, all right, and they did a legal maneuver called a stipulation to the evidence, all right, which means that they did not oppose or argue against any of the testimony or exhibits that were submitted at trial. Now, so the question then is, well, what was the trial about? Well, the trial was about whether or not Sirhan was mentally imbalanced at the time of the assassination. And so they pleaded that Sirhan was a paranoid schizophrenic, and that was the reason that he killed Kennedy, and therefore he should not get the death penalty by reason of insanity, okay? And so they tried that, and it didn't work, all right? And so Sirhan was condemned to death, but he was reprieved from that because in 1972, the California Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty in California. So in other words, if it hadn't been for that Supreme Court decision, Sirhan in all likelihood would be dead today. And the thing is that we now know that there isn't any way on God's green earth that Sirhan killed RFK. You know, he probably did wound some of the other bystanders in the pantry, but there isn't any way that he killed Robert Kennedy. All right? Now, I guess you want me to explain that, right?
Well, yeah. And I think this, the thing about this assassination compared to the other ones is it's almost more obvious than the other ones because there's multiple shots. Obviously, he only had 8 rounds, and there's tons of acoustic evidence now, recordings of more than 8 shots. There was some that were found in I believe, a doorway that was that they try to match his gun that didn't match. I mean, it's like so obvious, and then everything from like him not remembering. There's so much to this, and go into what's some of the more compelling evidence that the official story didn't make sense. And then also go into something that you touched a little bit about, because I know his psychiatrist, right? His when he was in prison, had a much different opinion on Sirhan than what the media was trying to sell as who he was. They were trying to make him out to be as this very angry. They talked about he had political motivations and all this stuff, but. I heard an interview with a psychiatrist, and said that he had a high IQ and he was very soft spoken, very likable and personable. So it was weird because I've heard some cases like in the Manson trial that one of the women that were tried in the Manson trial was given LSD during the trial, and some people, the theory is that to purposely make them look like they were crazy, or that they're insane or deranged or whatnot. And I wonder if this could have a similar type of issue where maybe he was given some substance during court or something like that to look less likable or less sane. And but yeah, I'll let you dissect some of the stuff I brought up.
All right. First of all, I agree with you. I think that the Robert Kennedy assassination, on certain grounds, is more clearly a conspiracy than the JFK cases or even the King case. All right, and it's pretty simple to understand why that's the case, because the scenario is that after Robert Kennedy claimed his victory in the California primary, he went ahead and he was walking to the Colonial Room to talk to the press. And so he cut through the pantry, okay? And there were about 72 witnesses, I think, in the pantry that night. Every one of them placed Sirhan in front of the senator, all right? And it was at a distance of about 2 to 5 feet. And that, by the way, that included the outstretched arm, all right? Okay, because we know that because the LAPD did 3 reconstructions of this. And each time they brought in different witnesses. All of them, and you can see films of the reconstruction, all right? All of them placed Sirhan at that distance. Right. So the problem with that, forensically speaking, is that when Thomas Noguchi did his autopsy, he was a coroner in LA at the time, he came to the conclusion, and by the way, this is a very good autopsy. It's not a piece of baloney like the JFK autopsy is. It's 62 pages long. And he spent weeks on it. He came to the conclusion that all the bullets that hit RFK, or one actually went through his shoulder pad of his jacket, so it didn't actually hit him, all right? All of those projectiles came in from behind and at extreme upward angles and at very close range. And when I say very close range, I mean like 1 to 3 inches. All right? Now, how on earth could Sirhan inflict those wounds standing in front of Robert Kennedy? All right? And let's not forget, it's not just because of the position. It's also because of the proximity. The fatal shot that killed Bobby Kennedy came in, according to Noguchi, behind his right ear. Now imagine this. Everybody, when Sirhan starts firing, all the eyes are turning towards the front, okay, because that's where he is. Now, do you really think that 72 witnesses would not have seen Sirhan's gun within 1.5 inches of the back of Kennedy's head? That's a pretty indelible image, don't you think?
Yeah, and wasn't he was immediately tackled too by some
right. Okay, that's something I was going to get to in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
But as I progress through this evidence.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the problem is not one witness did. Not one witness has ever said that they saw Sirhan with his revolver pressed against the back of his skull. All right? So you got to think, well, if 72 people missed it, then it probably didn't happen. All right? So that's one of the big problems. Okay? Now, as you mentioned, another big problem is that there is no denying that there were more bullets expelled that night than Sirhan could possibly contain in his revolver. And as you just mentioned, even at that, by the end of the first or at the latest the second shot, Carl Euchre, the maitre d' of the hotel, had grabbed Sirhan's gun hand. Now, Sirhan is maybe 5'4", 5'5", okay, about 130 pounds. Carl Euchre, if you've ever seen pictures of him, is like 6'1", about 225. All right? How on earth could Sirhan overcome that guy and keep on directing his shots at Senator Kennedy? All right? So that's another major problem. The other thing is that there's clearly more shots, evidence of more shots in that pantry than Sirhan could have ever fired. All right? There's, as you mentioned, there's evidence of shots in the door frame. There's evidence of shots in the divider. There's a swinging gate that goes into the pantry from the embassy room. There's evidence of shots in that divider on that swinging gate. And there's evidence of shots in the ceiling. All right? So most people today believe that there were probably 13 shots fired, at least 13 shots fired. All right? So automatically, there had to be a second gunman. All right? And when I say there's evidence of this, if you go to my article at Consortium News, all right, RFK, the End of an Era, I specifically discussed this evidence. I mean, it was not just ordinary average bystanders who saw this evidence. It was professional law enforcement people. FBI agent William Bailey and a couple of policemen with the LAPD, Rozzi and Wright. They both saw evidence of this. All right? Now, finally, there is an audio tape that surfaced a few years ago by a guy named Brad Johnson, news writer for CNN in Atlanta, found evidence that there was a Canadian reporter on leave in the United States covering the campaign of Robert Kennedy. His name was Stanislaw Brzezinski. And he was in the embassy room that night with his audio recorder. All right, he followed Kennedy as he walked to the pantry, had it on, and recorded the sounds. All right? Now, if you can believe this, and I don't believe it, we're supposed to believe the FBI and the LAPD missed that piece of evidence, even though it was taken from him and part of the in the evidence room of the Los Angeles Police Department. The FBI had a record of it. Brad discovered this, all right, in the California State Archives, all right, and he had it examined by a first-rate audio technician named Philip von Prague. Von Prague, after weeks of analysis on this thing, came to the conclusion that at least 13 sounds of bullet firings are on this tape. He said there might be more because what happened is that the screams in the pantry room eventually drown out the shots. But he detected before that time that there were 13 shots on that audio tape. All right. This coincides with the physical evidence that I was just mentioning. All right. Now, he also did a further analysis, and he concluded that on that tape, there's two sets of shots that occur much too closely together to be fired by the same person. All right? So that's more evidence of a second gun being there in the pantry that night. All right. So, again, that's just a brief summary, but just from the things I mentioned, I think anybody can see, that the RFK case is more demonstrably a conspiracy than the JFK case is. All right, and the only way it wasn't exposed in court is, as I said earlier, that Sirhan's lawyers did not argue the evidence. All right, they did what's called a stipulation to the evidence. That means that they did not contest any of the evidence that the prosecution put on. All right, and so that's why the guy was convicted, because of the incompetence of his lawyers.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, is that the problem with a lot of these assassinations is that the government and a lot of these, they're the ones investigating the assassination, but yet they're also the ones who were involved. So you have people covering up their own tracks. It's like that saying, having the wolf guard the hen house. It's the same idea. It's you have the government, or like the Warren Commission, or in this case, there's CIA, FBI, who knows who was directly involved, or who was the
LAPD. But the LAPD, the two guys running the investigation, Manny Pena and Hank Hernandez, had ties to the CIA. All right. Manny Pena actually resigned the LAPD, worked for the CIA, and came back to run the investigation of this. Hank Hernandez did interrogations for the CIA in foreign countries in Central and South America. All right, so the maybe I should explain that a little bit. See, the regular detectives on the LAPD, the regular homicide unit, did not investigate the RFK case. The chief of police set up a special division called SUS, standing for Special Unit Senator. The overall supervisor was a guy named Bill Houghton, but the day-to-day management of SUS was by the two guys I just mentioned, Pena and Hernandez, all right, who had been tied to the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, the reason that that's important, and that's not some wild conspiracy theory, these are all facts, all right, that I'm telling you, all right. The reason that that's important is because there is very powerful evidence that Sirhan was hypno-programmed, all right? And if you go to the website Who, What, Why, there's a long interview with a guy named Daniel Brown, who's written books, textbooks on hypnosis and crime, being interviewed by Shane O'Sullivan, and he talks about his interview sessions with Sirhan. All right? All right. Now, the idea of what we're talking about right now, of course, was first into popular culture with, I think, the 1959 novel by Richard Condon called The Manchurian Candidate. That was made into a film, which I think most people are familiar with, that had Lawrence Harvey, Janet Leigh, Angela Lansbury, and Frank Sinatra in it. Okay? A black and white film. I think it was 1962. It was made into a movie. Then it was remade a few decades later with Denzel Washington and Meryl Streep. All right. Now, now, I said it didn't come out in popular culture till 1959. But the point is, the CIA had been working on this program since 1948. Okay. All right. So, in other words, although it came out in a novel form, Condon must have had some kind of connections to the CIA because they had been working on it for 10 years. All right. And they used all kinds of, they supplemented hypnosis with drugs, okay, in order to go ahead and make the the victim more pliable, right? And so they actually, I think that they succeeded in 1954. They actually did an experiment where one of their secretaries was hypno-programmed to go ahead and kill another secretary, all right, except they put blanks in the gun. But they actually got her to do it, all right? And so they concluded that such a thing could be done, all right? And contrary to popular belief, at that time, most hypnotists at that time said that you cannot program a person to do something in an hypnotic state that they would never do in a waking state. They overcame that by implanting suggestions in the victim's mind about evil things that the other person was saying about them. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. See, if you can make the person believe that, contrary to what is true, that this person is doing these horrible things, you can get them to overcome that barrier. All right? And so that's what they did. All right? And so they refined it until they had it down pretty pat that they could do it. You know? And so many people believe, many people who study this case, the key to how this worked is the girl in the polka dot dress. All right? Now, I'm sure you've heard of that, right? You know who she is?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. There was a girl at the Ambassador Hotel that night that was dressed in a white dress with either dark blue or black polka dots, all right? She approached Sirhan at the bar, and they went to a small room behind the bar, which had a coffee urn at it, okay? And she started pouring him coffee. And she asked, "Do you want some sugar?" And they were removed from the room, and Sirhan's last memory is he's following her into the pantry. He's following her into the pantry. She's standing next to him. And by the way, I have to say, there's at least, me personally, myself, going through the files of the Special Unit Senator, I myself found 17 witnesses, okay, who saw this girl standing next to Sirhan. There's other people who found even more, but I think 17's enough, don't you? Okay, so they all saw her standing next to him. All right, with that dress, how could you forget it? All right, and so she's standing next to him. She smiles at him and gives him a little pinch on his neck. And that's the provocation that started him firing his gun. All right? Now, let me ask you what I think is a very logical question. If you were part of a conspiracy, and this was the object, why on earth would you wear such an unforgettable dress? And the answer to that question is that it would remind Sirhan of his target practice range. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it was a
trigger. He had taken up this sport of target shooting. And so that would resemble the black and white circles on the target. Okay? So if, as you believe as I do, that she probably put something in that coffee, all right, to make him more easy hypnotized, and that she was wearing that dress to tick him off about that, all right, And then somebody hypnoprogrammed him that said, when you get that pinch on the neck, Sirhan, you're going to go into range mode. You're at the range, firing at the target. All right? And that's the way I believe it worked. Now, if anybody thinks that's science fiction, it's not, because not only have I just mentioned how the CIA had been practicing this for, oh my God, 17 years, prior, to it happening, but also picture this. And I'm sure you've heard the tapes of this and you've seen the pictures and the films. Everybody in that pantry went crazy when this happened. They couldn't believe it just happened again after 2 months ago. We just had this happen with King, and they went into panic mode. They were either crying or screaming or falling on the floor, just collapsing, having a mini nervous breakdown, and everybody's shocked. But the girl in the polka dot dress runs out. She runs out with a companion, all right? And she goes down the stairs, the back of the hotel, and she says exuberantly, "We shot him. We shot him." And there's a young Kennedy worker there from Altadena named Sandy Serrano, who just wanted to get some clean air that night. She's standing near the base of the steps, and she says, "Who did you shoot?" And the girl says, "We shot Senator Kennedy." Now,
well, it was
how much more of a corroborative witness do you need?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it was a late night, right? It was by then, after his speech, it was like midnight or something like that, right?
It was about 12:30.
Yeah, something like that. And but isn't that, see, that's the part of the story that seems kind of why, from your just your research, why do you think somebody who is involved in such obviously a important assassination, why would they admit it to just a random person outside the door?
Obviously, I think what happened is that they wanted her to be a young girl, okay? And they wanted her to be, because they wanted somebody really attractive, okay, who Sirhan would be attracted to. And if you've ever seen the artist's renditions of her, she does seem to have a dark Middle Eastern look to her. Well, there's not going to be that many girls, okay, that you're going to find in California at that time, okay, for that kind of description. Okay, and so that's what they did. They went with somebody who they gambled on, as being definitely attractive to Sirhan, okay, and they didn't obviously, and by the way, the show's too short for me to go into this other aspect, but there was another witness. Have you ever heard of Robert Fahey?
The name sounds familiar, but
Okay, Fahey was a witness at the Ambassador Hotel that night. See, the girl wanted to back out. Okay, she didn't want to go through with it. All right, and she actually confided in this guy because they went on a ride that afternoon all the way out to Oxnard, California. All right, which is, you familiar with L.A.?
A little bit.
Okay, Oxnard, if you're driving from downtown L.A., Oxnard's probably about an hour away west towards the beach. Okay, and he had some business to do out there, and they went out there that afternoon, and they stopped at a restaurant, okay, and had a cup of coffee, and she was advising him don't be at the Ambassador tonight, all right? Okay, and she hinted around that she was going to be part of something. See, she didn't want to go through with it. Okay, so when you have somebody like that, who doesn't want to go through with it, okay, and is that young, the girl had to be less than 25 years old, all right, then I could believe that she would say something like that.
Yeah, just out of excitement or out of being a part of the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because, like you said, if it's a young person, it's obviously not somebody who's has a history of CIA veteran who knows how to handle stressful situations. You're talking about just a young person who, obviously something huge just happened, and out of the excitement, yeah, I could see how that could happen, absolutely. And
now the important part of the story, though, is this, that Pena and Hernandez knew that this was a really, really, really bad weakness in the official story, because a guy named Fernando Fora, who was a journalist at that time, got into this angle very quickly, and he was trying to find her. Where the hell, where did she go? What happened to her? He was trying to track her down. And then they did reconstructions for his newspaper, okay? And they actually suited up a girl, and they shot her from behind, okay, to simulate who this girl was. And they had the white dress with polka dots on it, all right? And this got on the front page of that newspaper. The girl in the polka dot dress is on the front page of the newspaper, all right? And so when Pena and Hernandez and the LAPD see this, they go, "Oh my God, oh Jesus criminy! We're going to have private investigators from all over the city. So we got to get rid of this story," and they did. And so this is what they did, and I've actually seen this also. Pena started to write on every witness report that a witness who saw the girl in the polka dot dress was Sirhan. He put a big X through it. Then at the top, he wrote down, "False lead, do not follow." So in other words, there was never any follow-up, okay, to that very, very important clue to the crime. All right, and then, of course, and I'm sure you've probably heard of this, then Hank Hernandez, whose job was to get rid of all the dangerous witnesses through his polygraph tests, all right, went ahead and gave Sandy Serrano, I don't even want to call it a polygraph test, because if you've heard it, and you can hear it on YouTube. Have you ever heard that examination?
Yeah, I believe so, yep.
Okay, it goes on for about 67 minutes, and it's not a polygraph test. It's clearly, it's almost like she's a prisoner of war, all right? And he's berating her and trying to talk her out of the story. She ends up whimpering towards the end because she's beaten down so badly, all right? And by the way, there was no lawyer there, and Hernandez had asked her aunt to leave. So it was really a pretty brutal, completely unethical. And so then when they did that, then Evo Younger, the DA of Los Angeles, trotted out in front of the media and said Sandy Serrano has taken back her story. And that was the end of the girl in the polka dot dress. Until, of course, after the trial, and this is another very bad part of this story, the DA's office and the LAPD both said that there would be complete openness and transparency after the trial. All right? In other words, if you were a private citizen and you wanted to find out about this stuff, you could go down to LAPD archives and, at the station, and all the records would be open to you. Well, that ain't what happened. That's not by a long shot. They were all closed. And there had people like Philip Melanson and Marilyn Barrett went ahead and started mounting legal challenges after legal challenges, and they were not open, I think, until 1986 or 87. So in other words, for about 18 years, the case file was closed. All right, the case file was closed. Nobody was able to see it. And so the case kind of went dead, with the legal blunders by his lawyers and the terrible legal tactic of declaring your client a paranoid schizophrenic. Okay, it kind of went dead. And so finally, when these files finally came open, people began to see, wait a minute, there's some real problems with this case. How did they go ahead and prosecute it as they did? And that's when you began to get some books on the RFK case all right, that were actually very good, like Philip Melanson's book. I should note there's one exception to that. The Bill Turner John Christian book that I think was published in 1978. Those two guys did a lot of work on the Robert Kennedy assassination. Bill Turner was a former FBI agent. Christian was a news reporter. And they did a pretty good book on the RFK case. So that was the one good book in that whole meantime that was published on the case. All right. And so finally, with the opening up of the archives, then people began to get a lot more of the actual evidence, that was held back. For instance, the LAPD collected all the cameras that were at the Ambassador Hotel that night. And they confiscated all the film. They developed all the pictures. And then they incinerated 2,400 photographs that were taken that night. By the way, that's right in their notes that they did that. So it's really, of what we do have, is still fairly valuable. But there's clearly a lot of evidence that was deep six, because, when this is my experience with certain government agencies, if they can get rid of something that's a liability to their case, and they can make sure that there's not really much of a trail behind it, more often than not, they will do it. Okay? And so that's what happened with some of the RFK case archives. But there is still some very, very, very interesting stuff, And there were some people who went out there and campaigned, like Paul Schrade, who was actually a victim that night, standing right behind, about 3 or 4 feet behind Bobby Kennedy. Well, to cover up what happened, the LAPD criminalist, Dwayne Wolfer. See, like I said earlier, there were too many shots, too much evidence of shots, and not enough ammunition. So Wolfer had one shot going through RFK's jacket, not actually hitting his body, from behind, going upward, and hitting Schrade in the middle of the forehead. Now, Schrade, like I said, is about 4 feet behind Robert Kennedy. So when Schrade saw that, he said, my God, I would have to be 9 feet tall, bending over at the waist to get hit with that shot. All right? And so in other words, you have the magic bullet theory also in the RFK case, not just the JFK case. And so when Schrade heard that, he said that was the end of innocence for me, and he became one of the most outspoken critics of the official story. All right? So that's a general summary of the RFK case, about the problems in the evidence and the way the plot probably actually worked with the hypno-programming, the girl in the polka dot dress, and the cover-up that came afterwards. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. has now joined the ranks of people, thank God, who don't believe this. And there's been a series of stories, if you can believe it, and of all places, the Washington Post, by a guy named Tom Jackman, who has written, I think, 4 stories in about 2 weeks on the RFK case. All right? And so those stories have gotten some attention, and they've been picked up by other media. So it's a very, very interesting development in that case. Because I always thought, I've studied all 4 of the major assassinations of the 60s. That is JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy. And I've always thought that the Robert Kennedy case did not get anywhere near the attention it deserved, for a lot of different reasons, because of the circumstances, because when you first mentioned it to someone, like back in the 80s or 90s, and you said something like, there's some really serious questions, and they would say, oh, come on, you have 70 people seeing a guy there, jumping out and firing away. So and then all you have to do is say, okay, if he's standing right there in front of him, how come Noguchi's autopsy says that all the shots are and you have to explain it to him? It's rather easy to explain, but the media had done such a horrible job on both Sirhan and the RFK case that most of the public didn't understand that case at all. It's really a shame, how it got kind of tucked down the memory hole, as part of the public consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, just doing research on YouTube, you'll find interviews saying that Sirhan explaining his motives and stuff like that, and what they'll do, they'll just splice together him, I'm assuming, answering questions about his upbringing in Palestine, and it's their way of trying to make it look like he was politically motivated. But what they don't show you is him admitting that he doesn't remember doing it, that he doesn't recall, that he's sorry about it. He's been denied for parole many times, denied for a retrial, and so if he didn't remember doing it, then what you've been talking about, it sounds crazy, this idea that he could be hypnotized, but I mean, anybody who knows anything about the MK Ultra project or Operation Artichoke, the government and the CIA have been dealing with this for a long time. They've been messing around with LSD and shock therapy and all these weird things, and obviously there's tons of declassified paperwork that came out. I don't know if it was the 80s or 90s, but they declassified a bunch of stuff that proves that this operation did exist, and Operation Climax or Midnight Climax, all these things that prove that this the government was actually spending taxpayers' money and trying to figure out all these methods of brainwash and changing people's psyche and consciousness and all this. So it sounds like it's something out of a movie, which eventually it was the Manchurian Candidate was represented a similar situation, but the other weird thing is how Robert Kennedy had his last dinner the night before his assassination, speaking of movies, was actually with the filmmaker of The Manchurian Candidate, correct?
John Frankenheimer.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
John Frankenheimer was the director of The Manchurian Candidate.
What a weird coincidence.
And Kennedy was staying at his house while he was campaigning in California. By the way, it's not just he had dinner there the night before. Frankenheimer actually drove him to the hotel that day.
Wow.
Okay. So talk about a huge irony. Yeah,
and people said, I guess he talked to JFK about making the film before his assassination.
Yes.
So it's like he has links to kind of both assassinations, which is pretty surreal, But this idea of brainwashing or something like that, it does seem like science fiction, but like I said, there's declassified information. I think there's even in the past, I've even seen testimonies of people who are part of the the operations, a lot of these brainwashing operations, where I think one video I saw was a girl who had a photographic memory, and she was kind of remembering some of the things that were happening to her. And a lot of it, they would do it to kids that were orphans or drug addicts or people who nobody would really come looking for, or people cared about them. So it's kind of sad.
Yeah, I think the girl you're talking about is the Control of Candy Jones. All right, that was a famous book that was published about how they hypno-programmed a girl to serve as a messenger. Okay, between intelligence agencies. And by the way, I've inspected this whole phenomenon, because I was very doubtful about it myself, because I'm a kind of person that you could probably never hypnotize, all right? But there are people who are susceptible to this. And a few years ago, I went down to a couple of hypnosis shows, near San Diego. And I got in and I watched it, and if you see the way this works, okay, the hypnotist picks somebody who he can tell is a very good subject, and it's very easily done once you have the right subject. And I've seen it done twice, all right, at two separate shows. And you can get these people. I mean, it's really remarkable to see what you can get them to do. They can sit up, they can, walk around the stage, acting like a quacking duck. And then they don't remember it. Okay?
Yeah, there's a comedian, I think his name's Frank Santos, who does it. And, I've never been to one of his shows, but people talk about how he gets people to take off their clothes and, like you said, act like a duck.
Yeah.
And he filters out the people who he thinks it's not going to work on. He brings people on stage, and like you said, you can kind of pinpoint who you think is more likely to go along with this for this to work on. And so, like you said, it might not work on everybody, but when you're talking about Sirhan, it's quite possible whatever was in the coffee could have made it easier for him to be triggered.
Oh no, but he was a very good subject, because as you mentioned earlier, the psychiatrist who treated Sirhan later, Simpson Callis, who was the supervisor of the prison he was at, okay, he came to the conclusion that what had happened at the trial was a terrible, terrible miscarriage of justice. He could not see how Sirhan could have ever done, what the authorities said he did, and he did not believe Sirhan was a paranoid schizophrenic. All right? He said Sirhan was very, very susceptible to hypnosis. All right? And he had studied the phenomenon, and going through the record and actually hypnotizing Sirhan, he said Sirhan is a very, very, very good subject for hypnosis. Another psychiatrist, Herb Spiegel, who was probably the leading hypnotist in the country at that time, he reviewed the record. And he said, on a 1 to 5, Sirhan is a 5. Okay, when you're talking about sorting out subjects for hypnosis. This other guy who was the last psychologist, he went even further than Spiegel. He said on a 1 to 10, Sirhan is an 11. He said the problem I had with Sirhan was not getting him to go under. The problem I had with Sirhan was getting him out. Okay, sometimes I had a really hard time snapping him out of a trance. Okay? So he is what we talk about, an ideal subject to be hypnoprogrammed. And once you have somebody under, a very skilled hypnotist can set up what are called blocks in the mind. In other words, there's things he doesn't want you to remember. And he can set up those blocks in your brain so you don't remember them. Okay, and Daniel Brown, the last guy, but not just Daniel, but other people said this, it is very clear that whoever originally hypnoprogrammed Sirhan set up those blocks in his mind, so he can't actually recall the guy who did the hypnoprogramming. All right? So, see, it's a very, very interesting subject, all right, which most of the American public, has not been exposed to. But there have been several books that are published about it. When Richard Helms left the CIA in 1973, he ordered something like 14,000 pages of the CIA's experiments which were codenamed MK Ultra, the last stage, to be destroyed. All right? And we still have records on this, but Helms got about 14,000 pages to be destroyed before he left. You know? So it's a very, very fascinating subject, you know, and let me make one last thing about this.
Yeah.
When I think it was either Simpson Kalis or the court-ordered psychologist, a guy named Bernard Diamond, who dug up a very famous case, which I think took place in 1953 in Denmark, where a young man named Palle Hardrup rode his bicycle, drove up to a bank, with a gun, and tried to hold up the bank, and he went ahead and shot a couple of people, all right, and he was apprehended. He was thrown into jail, and he was assigned a criminal psychologist, all right, and doing several interviews with Hardrup, the psychologist came to the conclusion, all right, that I don't believe this guy would do this on his own, all right, and he came to the conclusion that Hardrup was hypnoprogrammed. He got the prison authorities to go ahead and give him permission to deprogram him, all right? And they found out that the real guy who had programmed him was his so-called friend Bjorn Nilsson, all right? And so what happened is that Hardrup got off, and Nilsson was convicted for the crime. So there are precedents to this kind of thing happening. All right. Okay. So in real life, not just CIA experiments, but there's an example of it happening, you know, in real life in Denmark.
Yeah. There's an English illusionist or mentalist called Darren Brown who you can find examples of him online on YouTube of him brainwashing. Like people in the mall, tons of examples of him doing this stuff. So it absolutely can happen. I think, like you said, people weren't familiar with it. It sounds kind of crazy, but I think that's also the majority of people also think that, hey, I couldn't be hypnotized. That sounds crazy, but, who knows? Maybe I could be, and maybe the people listening could be. So I think that there's a lot more to the brain and getting influencing our psyche and our consciousness than we understand. I mean, you can go all the way back to Edward Bernays and him trying to understand how to influence people's desires and wants and their opinions and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot more that we think we have much more control of our opinions and our actions than sometimes we really do.
Well, it's funny you should bring up Darren Brown. Because he's the English guy who he actually did something like what happened to Sirhan. I'm sure you saw that show. He hypnotized a guy to go ahead and shoot this actor on stage, during a performance.
That's right.
All right. He hypnoprogrammed them, and he took them through all the steps. And the guy actually did it.
Yep.
He did it. He actually went ahead and pulled out a gun and shot the guy in front of hundreds of witnesses. All right. And I think that's on YouTube.
Yeah.
All right.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no doubt that it can be done. I mean, look, when you got as much money as the CIA does, and you're essentially above the law, then you can do stuff like this. All right. It only seems odd to the ordinary average person, who's so concerned with his, making a living and getting through his next paycheck, that they're not aware of this stuff, So, and that's what they capitalize on, of course. But that's in the real world, criminals and the Central Intelligence Agency, et cetera. Okay, then, yeah, this kind of stuff happens.
Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the letters, the writings of RFK Must Die. How do you explain that? You think that's all a part of also him obviously being brainwashed, or
yes, he doesn't remember writing those things.
Yep.
Okay, and there's such a thing as putting somebody under and having them do what they call automatic writing. All right, you can program the guy to write something. All right, and by the way, let me add one other thing. There is a suspect. I don't want to leave this conversation, with any kind of hole in the case. There is a suspect as to who the hypno-programmer was. All right, and his name was William Bryan, who had a huge medical complex on the west side of Los Angeles at around this time. Now, what makes him a suspect? Imagine this. The night of the Rfk assassination, nobody knows what the heck happened. All right? And nobody even knows who this Sirhan guy is. All right? And everybody's in a state of shock because of what just happened 2 months earlier. So, of course, this is going to interrupt normal radio programming, and so the Ray Bream Show, which had been a very famous talk show at that time, goes on the air. All right, and they open up the lines, and they all want to talk about what just happened. A guy gets on the air, asks a question, and he says, Ray, from what I can understand about this, it sounds like this Sirhan fellow was probably in some kind of a trance. Who the hell at that time could possibly even believe or think of something like that? It turns out that the guy was this William Bryan, this very famous psychologist and hypnotist, okay, who had this huge clinic on the west side of Los Angeles. Bryan was very high up in the Navy as part of their programming. All right? At one time, he boasted that he was in charge of the entire naval brainwashing program at one time. He also boasted that he was a consultant on the movie The Manchurian Candidate. All right? And he actually boasted to a couple of call girls. All right, he had a very voracious sexual appetite, and they said that he used to brag about how he hypnotized Sirhan. Wow. All right, okay, and so this is the prime suspect that most people believe was the actual programmer. All right, so in other words, that's another piece of the puzzle that we managed to fill in with a probable suspect. So this is not in any way, kind of fictional or speculative. Okay, it's all, when you figure it out, it's all kind of logical, and it fits into a definite pattern.
Well, the '60s just seem crazy when you look at all the assassinations that you've been researching for a long time. I mean, just in a short period of time, there's all these assassinations, and the fact that that anybody would think that it's just a coincidence that you look at JFK gets shot, then Oswald gets shot, then Jack Ruby mysteriously dies, Then, Robert Kennedy runs for office. Looks like there's a very good chance that he could become the next president and maybe even open up the investigation on his brother. And then he gets shot. Sirhan doesn't remember what happened. And I remember that there's a video, which you listen to the audio when Robert Kennedy gets shot. They grab Sirhan, and you hear somebody saying, you probably know who it is. I'm not sure who it was. It was like, "We don't want another Oswald. We don't want another Oswald." And,
right.
Apparently they didn't have to worry about that because Oswald, he obviously remembered everything and was very aware of what was going on, and even gave out hints like, "Hey, I'm just a patsy." But Sirhan, even if if they couldn't take him out, they didn't have to because he didn't remember anything anyways.
Right. And that was a big difference. They could afford to keep Sirhan alive because he would not have any memory of what put him in that place where he was. All right? So that's a very important distinction between the two cases. And you're also right. The LAPD, almost from the beginning, said, we don't want another Dallas. Okay? We don't want another big conspiracy. Okay? And so they deliberately went ahead and tailored the case to make it as simple as possible, no matter how they had to falsify the circumstances.
Now, but before I let you go, one thing that we didn't hit on, and I think it's a really important part of I guess, any murder or assassination or any crime, is motive. What do you think was the biggest reason why they wanted to take him out? Were they similar reasons to why they took out his brother? And then also, when I say they, maybe you might want to clarify on who exactly you think was the mastermind, or who do you think had the most involvement in putting this all together or orchestrating it?
Well, okay, as far as why they had to get rid of Robert Kennedy, it's very, very obvious, all right, at the very latest, late 1966, early 1967, that Bobby Kennedy is going to be a very big figure on the American scene, and he's also going to go ahead and start talking about ending the war in Vietnam, all right? There's also hints that you can see in David Talbot's book, Brothers, that Robert Kennedy was being convinced that what happened to JFK was not by a lone assassin, that it was a conspiracy. And he had talked about this to some people in his camp about reopening the JFK case, all right? And I personally believe that Robert Kennedy would have gotten a nomination because Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, who controlled the Illinois delegation, had called him and said, "I'm going to be backing you in Chicago." I also believe that he would have beaten Nixon. I also believe he would have even beaten him in California, his home state. All right? If you take a look at that race between Humphrey and Nixon, Humphrey had a very big problem at the beginning of the war, at the beginning of the campaign, because of Johnson escalating the Vietnam War and Humphrey being his vice president. It wasn't until October when he finally decided to come out and say that we're not going to prosecute this war anymore that he started to gain on Nixon. See, Bobby wouldn't have had that problem. All right? Secondly, there would have been no, I'm sure you've read about and seen the films of all the violence at the Chicago Convention.
Yeah.
All right? And that was on national television, And so people get, look, these guys can't even run their own convention, And so with all that, that wouldn't have gone on with Bobby Kennedy there. And in fact, a lot of it was caused because Bobby Kennedy was killed. Okay? And so I think those are the major reasons why. Now, as to who, I don't think the mafia did hypno-programming assassins. Okay, so, so I think, although it is interesting that James Angleton had autopsy pictures of Bobby Kennedy in his files. So
That's interesting.
So I think that's a kind of interesting piece of information. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. I had Jeffrey Marley on not too long ago talking about James, and yeah, that's something I did not know about, and I haven't heard anybody mention. That's yeah, I mean, it's just these stories are so fascinating, and I think it's so important for people like myself to continuously try to get people, experts like you guys on to talk about this, because people my age just, there's a lot. It's amazing how little they know of the JFK, the Rfk assassination, the MLK assassination. Like, people know they happened, but besides the JFK assassination, like you said, who I think is pretty, I think most people will have some questions about the official story, thanks to probably Oliver Stone and his film, which, I believe you're a consultant for and helped out with some of the information. But because there was no film about these other assassinations, a lot of people don't even realize how many holes are in the official story, or that there was even a possible conspiracy to begin with. And it amazes me. And these are such important points in history, because I feel like after JFK assassination, like, a lot of the world changes, and I mean, the way I look at it is, if we come to the conclusion that a democratically elected president of the United States can be taken out in broad daylight, and then his brother can be taken out, and then, like, what couldn't be happening right now?
Right.
I just think it just opens up the door of possibilities. That's why when I hear some crazy theory about what's going on geopolitically or whatnot, I'm like, nothing is off the table for me, because after the JFK assassination, and then look at what happened to Oswald, they mysteriously took him out, and then you look at what happened to Robert Kennedy and MLK, like, what couldn't be happening? But I think there's some disconnect. People are disconnected because they feel like that happened a long time ago, and stuff like that couldn't be happening now. But a lot of the stuff at the time, they don't realize there is all these holes in the official story and stuff, until people like yourself look into it and expose all the holes and highlight all the holes, and years later. So even now, some of that stuff that we're being fed in the mainstream media, and what we think is the established history, some of that will be unraveled, down the line too. So I think it's very important to question the official stories and question everything, because, like I said, if those events can happen, then anything can happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And by the way, I look, I'm old enough to be alive back then, and I understand what the political dynamics were back then. All right, 1961 to 1968. All right, it was a whole different world. It was a whole different attitude.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a whole different set of values. Okay, that America was about back then. If you weren't alive back then, you don't understand the kind of tension and excitement that was riveting through the country. All right, and the incredible news stories that you would, George Wallace, Kennedy nationalizing the State National Guard and removing him from the front of his college so that Vivian Malone and James Hood could be the first two black students to go there. That kind of stuff was happening every month. You'd see something like that going on, All right, and so it was really a different political dynamic at that time. When at that very short period of time, from 1961 to 1963, where you actually had all those four guys alive. JFK, Malcolm X, King, and Bobby Kennedy. It was really, I mean, can you imagine something like that happening today? I sure can't. Okay, but you actually had them all, and so as many people when you speculate about this stuff, the other side decided, look, we're not going to put up with 8 years of this stuff, and then we got to put 8 more years because Bobby will probably run then. We're talking about 16 years. Okay, they weren't going to stay out of power that long. The country might have been permanently changed. And so, as Mort Saul used to say, they decided to play hardball. And they succeeded. All right. Yeah. See, and part of it, of course, is this whole thing we're talking about. When you unleash, clandestine actions or covert actions, domestically, the people don't know how to react to them. I mean, for sure, the media didn't know how to react to them. And so they managed to change the whole calculus of the debate. And in my opinion, this country really hasn't been the same since. The right wing took over, and, now we have these prominent neoconservatives in so many positions, throughout the State Department, even when the Democrats take over. All right? There's these people there. And so, it's a very important thing, I believe, to make people aware of that, of the sea change that took over this country in 1968. All right? I mean, I don't think that Richard Nixon would have been elected if Bobby Kennedy, would have survived. All right? And Richard Nixon was a very, like I've said in some of the articles I've written, he was kind of the anti-RFK, and I'm not exaggerating very much at all. Bobby called him a scumbag, which he was, and so, I mean, can you imagine lengthening that war in Vietnam for 4 more years and then expanding it into Cambodia and Laos? Knowing, by the way, this is the most important part. In 1968, there's been documents surfaced that Nixon knew that early that the war could not be won. All right, but he still went ahead and prosecuted it for 4 more years, expanded it into Cambodia and Laos, and dropped more bombs over Vietnam than Lyndon Johnson did. And when it was finally over, there had been more bombs dropped on Indochina than the United States dropped on Europe during World War II. And the ultimate irony of that, let me tell you what the ultimate irony of that is. I had dinner at a Vietnamese cuisine restaurant a couple weeks ago, and the owner was Vietnamese, and his brother was working for him, waiting on my table. And I asked him, I said, have you been back to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City? He goes, yeah, I was just back there about a month ago. And I go, well, what's it like? He goes, oh, you wouldn't believe it. It's full of Starbucks and McDonald's. So, in other words, what the hell was that all about then?
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Well, what they told what it was all about was
why did 4 million people have to die? The same thing was going to just look at it this way. It would have just happened earlier.
Yeah, it would have got westernized. Yeah, it was going to get westernized eventually, and that seems like it's happening all over the world. I mean, it's kind of sad. I mean, you travel, and before when you traveled, one of the beautiful things about traveling was, kind of inhaling their culture of certain parts of the country or certain, different countries. And now it's just like wherever you go, there's a McDonald's, there's a Starbucks, there's a,
right.
Yeah. I mean,
Burger King.
Yeah. It's just, no place seems that unique, or at least what made it unique, it's losing some of it. And, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the Pentagon Papers also talked about, how they were lying to the public, and they knew that things were much worse than they were letting the public know, and all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it was obviously a lot of people died, and that's the thing that drives me fucking crazy. I mean, it drives me absolutely crazy. Just how many people will never be the same. You know, people who mentally will never be the same, veterans who will never be the same, people who lost loved ones and their families will never be the same. And then all the government does is basically shrug their shoulders and say, "Oops, yeah, we messed up." And they did the same thing in you know, they did the same thing in Iraq. They did the same thing, you know,
Right.
in so many other wars. And we'll do the same thing in Syria, and we'll continue doing it. And it's amazing how, you know, obviously you have amazing memory, because it always just, it's amazing to me how many names you remember and dates and stuff like that. But the average American public obviously has a horrendous memory, because it seems like after making a mistake like Vietnam or Iraq, like we're so easily convinced that going into another country is a good idea again. And it's like we have awful, apparently, long-term memory, because we're just constantly making the same mistakes over and over again. The outcome never ends up being good. And we always end up looking back at it and just shrugging our shoulders and saying, yeah, oops, maybe we shouldn't have done that, you know? So I think people have to rethink this whole thing and just really think like, okay, with all these experts and analysts and people who, you know, their jobs are to just analyze these wars and conflicts and stuff like that, they obviously know that, you know, it's not going to be good and the outcome's not going to be good, and there's going to be a lot of lives lost and money spent. And at the end, what did we gain? You know, but we have to rethink that, hey, maybe the reason they're getting involved isn't the reasons we're being told. There's war profiteers, there's you know, corporations and politicians and lobbyists, and everybody's making money and getting influences from other you know, other people, and you know, and then they just sell us chemical weapons, Syria and chemical weapons. Just throw out that term, and they can get what they want again. And it's yeah, I mean, I think it's scary. And this goes back to, like you said, you know, I've heard people say similar things about after JFK, the world has never been the same. And now you're hearing a lot of conversations about the deep state and shadow government and all this stuff. But, you know, you can make the argument that that's what happened when JFK got assassinated. It was a shadow government or some type of deep state. You know, the people who were really pulling the strings had to take out somebody who actually wanted to make change and you know, and obviously he wasn't a perfect president, and he wasn't the president for long, you know, so he really didn't have much time to do anything.
But wait a minute, they got rid of all four of them.
Yeah, well, that's true.
It wasn't just JFK. They wiped out all four of them.
Yeah.
You know, and that more or less, you know, and I said that in my article, it was the end of an era. You know, when you got rid of all four, I personally think that was kind of overkill. You know, but they made sure that there was none of them left.
Well, that's the thing that's kind of interesting. When you grew up in that era, like, because it almost seemed so obvious that it couldn't be a coincidence that they all get assassinated so close in time. Like, growing up in that era, what did most people think the same thing, like this couldn't be a coincidence, or were there actually people who thought like, okay, I believe the official story? Like, I get it if you believe the official story after the first assassination, or maybe after the second, or maybe after even the third, you know, that seems even hard to believe. But after the fourth, I mean, I don't see how anybody could believe that it was just a coincidence. Well,
see, this is something that you should understand. The media back then, number one, it had a lot of credibility. All right, you know, Uncle Walter and that kind of stuff, Walter Cronkite.
Yep.
The Huntley Brinkley Report, etc. All right, and there really wasn't a heck of a lot of what they call alternative media. Today, you do have all that stuff. All right, you do have it. All right. But back then there really wasn't. And if you grew up someplace out of New York City or Los Angeles, you know, in the hinterland someplace, you know, you really didn't get a lot of this information. The first time I began to have some really serious doubts about this was in 1967 or 68 when I read the Playboy Interview with Jim Garrison. All right, that was the first time that I began to have some serious doubts about those cases, because I just really wasn't exposed. And if you remember, Garrison was being pilloried and pummeled, as some kind of a quack and a nutcase, when he came out with what he thought had happened. And so it wasn't until when I picked up that interview, which was the longest interview that Playboy had ever done up to that time, all right, that I began to get an alternative point of view on what had happened. Now, here's my question, though. If you were really a professional reporter back then, and this was your job to cover all this stuff, how could you not, by June of 1968, say something like, wow, this is like two of these guys in 2 months. Can this really just be a coincidence? And if you really were an enterprising reporter, why didn't you go talk to Thomas Noguchi? And say, well, what do you think happened, doctor? And you'd have got an earful. So this is what I always say. I can't really blame myself because I didn't have access and I wasn't exposed to a lot of the really good information. But no, not one single person in the media really took this. The closest I can ever recall at that time on television, one night Truman Capote was on The Tonight Show. And it was so unusual. This is why I remember it so well. I think it was 1968. And he said something. He said, John, isn't it kind of funny when you think about it? I'm a writer. I've been a writer all my life. I don't keep a diary. But yet all these guys who are uneducated, some of them didn't graduate from high school, they keep diaries. Which is true, and nobody ever noticed that. That would be kind of odd, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I've written music for a long time. I play music, and I do podcasts. I research. I don't have a diary, and it's interesting. You're right, because it seems like it's no different than like planting a suicide letter or something like that. I just think it's a way of trying to sell the public, of trying to, it's like, well, look, they wrote this, so it must be true, and,
right.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just amazing that they use the same tactic over and over again. And like you said, it's one of the many coincidences that all these assassinations have. I mean, all these assassinations have a lot of similarities and a lot of links to one another. And it's just, I mean, it amazes me. But you're right. I mean, it was a different time. People did trust the media much more. At that time, people read the newspaper and the Washington Post and the New York Times. Like these were respected newspapers, and people, trusted the articles they were reading. And today, people, I think, are much more cautious of what they're reading. I think it's almost gone in reverse. I think I remember when I first started podcasting, I remember thinking before I started podcasting, and I really got into all these history and alternative views on history. I was getting a lot of my research online, and it wasn't that hard to find good alternative research. But now there's almost so much stuff online that it makes it harder now, because it's like you have to filter out the bullshit. You have to filter out the bad information to get to actual good information. So at first it was easy. You go online and there's a handful of respected website. You brought up Who, What, Why. I've always been a fan of Russ Baker. He's been on the show like 3-4 times. And you have websites like that and that you trust, and now it's just like, you look up something, it's like you really, and then never mind the fact that now Google and well, I shouldn't say now, it's probably been happening for a long period of time. Google is controlling which sites you're being referred to first and all that stuff, so they're putting out the information that they want. And Facebook's doing the same, all the social media sites. And is that something you stay away from? Are you on social media, or do you, because now like at 90?
I'm on Facebook, because I have a couple pages on Facebook, and I put up notes about the new articles. But I'm not a really big frequenter of Facebook. Okay.
Yeah, the weird thing is the majority of the youth gets their news from the internet. Sadly this morning Anthony Bourdain passed away, and first time I saw it was on Twitter first thing this morning. I saw that he passed away, and that's how a lot of people get their news now. It's online. It's on social media, I should say. And but now when more information is coming out that these social media sites are controlling what you're seeing or what you can or cannot hear, or what you can and cannot see, now that's being even controlled. So even these very, kind of similar to like you talked about in the 60s, how people trusted the media. You trusted these sites that they were just going to be, just basically a open place where people can share anything. But now that that's being changed and they're influencing what you see and what you don't see, now you can't trust that either. So now it's like it's getting harder and harder to believe anything you read or see. So the one thing I love about podcasts is that somebody like myself, you can go on these shows. Most of the time there isn't a agenda trying to be sold. There isn't some sponsors trying to influence the topics you're talking about or where those conversations go. So it's almost one of the few places where you can get actual conversation about actual topics, important topics and subjects, without any censorship or agenda, which I think is super important. And I think that's why podcasts have gotten so popular. And I'm glad it gives people like yourself a place to put out this information, because I mean you're just a ball of information. Every time I talk to you, I'm just blown away by just how much information you've consumed and how much research you've put into this, and I think it's really important to have people like yourself out there really reminding us why these stories are important and why these historical moments are important. And like you said, and in many cases people believe that how it's changed history forever.
Well, yeah, definitely.
But thanks a lot, Jim. I don't want to take up any more of your time. You live in Los Angeles, so I'm sure the weather is beautiful, and you have other things you want to do on this beautiful Friday. But thank you so much.
And let me give a couple of plugs out before we depart, okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. My website, kennedysandking.com, where you get a lot of different articles on all these things, plus news articles. And my recently published book, the JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today. All right? And so thank you so much for giving me the 90 minutes to talk about the RFK case. All right? It's belatedly overdue.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with me and taking the time to do it. It's you're one of my favorite researchers when it comes down to this stuff. I've always really looked forward to hearing interviews with you and seeing your work, and I'm just glad that you're still willing to do it, and even after all these years. And I've mentioned it on the last podcast. I'll mention it again. I haven't forgot about it. I still want to get a JFK assassination roundtable with yourself and a couple other researchers. Russ Baker's one that said that he was more than happy to be involved in also, and really put emphasis on the importance of that, because I think, like you mentioned, I think the world did change after that assassination, and it's why, and that reason is why it's so important to constantly talk about it and really just remind people that, hey, if that can happen, then anything can happen, and let's remember history so we don't repeat it.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Another awesome podcast. I can't thank Jim enough to come on, and it was just a great conversation. Always a ball of knowledge. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I know I always tell you, but let me remind you, subscribe to us on YouTube. Our channel is RV Theory 6, or just search the Ripple Effect Podcast. There are some people who put my podcast episodes on their channels, which is completely fine. It's completely cool, but I just wanted to let you know that if you're looking for the original content, then RV Theory 6 is the channel name. So definitely do that. And I've told you guys, post my show anywhere you want this information. is way more important than trying to get traffic towards me. It's way more important to share this information and get it out there. So if you want to post my podcast, any episode that you find interesting or important on your website, on your YouTube channel, or any of that stuff, please do. And also RV36 is my Instagram handle. It's also, in case you guys want to see pictures of me and my kids, my car, any of what I eat, all the ridiculous things that people post on Instagram. Also, Twitter is where I constantly try to share interesting articles. Recently, it's been harder because I've been just, busy with work and being a dad and being a husband and all that stuff and summer stuff. But on Twitter, I try to share articles, documentaries, interesting YouTube videos, anything like that. So if you want to just, I guess, see any of that stuff, follow me on Twitter, RV36. And I'm also on Facebook. And like I've told you guys in the past, just look me up. Feel free to send me a friend request. Obviously, if it's somebody I don't know, then I'll just probably look at their page real quick just to make sure that it's not spam or some robot trying to send me some nude pictures or get me to download some porn or whatnot. So, if you look like a real person, then I'll assume that if I don't know you, you're a fan of the show, and I'll accept that. And you can keep up with my life and my podcast on that. Ripple Effect Podcast is also on Facebook, so you can like us on there. And I think that's about it. Write a review. Everybody who has, by the way, thank you so much. I haven't read the reviews in a long time, but I remember last time I did. It was just awesome to see just the really nice words and people who really appreciate what I'm trying to do. It's not always easy. Today, for example, got out of work. I'm still in my work clothes. My wife had to work, so I had to. My parents watched the kids while I did the podcast. Now I got to go pick them up, so it's constantly running around. And while doing all this, I'm trying to refresh my memory with the Rfk Assassination and listen to podcasts on my drive to work and doing errands and before I go to bed, watching some documentaries just to kind of refresh my memory to make sure that when we talk about this stuff, I know what I'm talking about. And so it's hectic, but everybody's life is hectic. My life isn't any different than any of you guys listening, and I think that's probably why you like the show, because I've been told by many listeners that one of the appeals to the show is the fact that I am very similar to the people listening. I have a full-time job. I don't speak correctly all the time. I forget shit sometimes. I swear sometimes. And I'm not perfect, and I'm not this robot sounding perfect speaker, intellectual type person. And I try to be just as honest and with my opinions and stuff, but also open to new ideas and perspectives, which is super important because as a past guest, Hunter Moss and I have talked about many times, is it's really important not just to share your ideas, but be open for your ideas to be challenged, and challenging ideas is very important and very hard for people to let their ideas be challenged without getting defensive. And so I'm glad I have this platform to do this. I'm glad that you guys are all on this journey with me. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Also, we did a Fight with Friends recently. We haven't done one in a long time, so let me just refresh your memory. A Fight with Friends is when we watch MMA event, usually a UFC pay-per-view. We stream it live on our YouTube channel. You can watch us and listen to us. And so if you want to watch the event and then with us and have us in the background, it's awesome. If you want to listen to the podcast afterwards, you can. It was influenced by Joe Rogan, who does the same thing called the Fight Companion, where him and his buddies just hang out, drink, talk, and watch the fights and kind of just bullshit about the fights and everything else going on in life. So our show is very much similar, and I apologize if there's times that we go quite a few minutes without talking about the fights, but I think that's what makes it fun, and you guys continuously download it, so I think that's there's an appeal to that. Me just hanging out with obviously you hear these shows with me and an expert, a guest. We talk about specific topics. But when it's just me doing the Fight with Friends, it's just literally me hanging out with my friends, getting silly, being ridiculous, making jokes that, are over the top that we probably regret saying. We're drinking, we're having fun, and hopefully that comes through in the audio through the podcast. You can kind of hear that it's just us having a blast, being silly, and I've had a lot of my friends who've been on the show during the Fights with Friends say, I can't go back and listen to it. I'm so embarrassed, and and it's just one of those things where you forget sometimes that you're in front of a microphone. So sometimes me and my friends, we're silly and we act silly, and when we do, we say stupid shit, and then when the next day comes around and you realize it's online probably forever, then you start regretting some of the shit you said. But I'm just glad I'm able to capture some of that silliness and just having fun, and I'm glad that you guys are enjoying it. So usually don't do outros. I usually have a long-winded intro, but that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day, whatever day I end up releasing this, hopefully very soon. It's the week of the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, or RFK assassination, sorry. So hopefully I'll get it out really soon while all this RFK assassination conversation is going on in the media and stuff like that. So I'll see you on the next one, guys. Peace.
Believe in the ripple effect.